This semester is going to be a series of talks trying to understand the relationships between development, and especially development efforts, and political violence. And if there's sort of one common theme across the talks, I would say it's something like the following, that we want to challenge the assumption that the global community can easily foster development and reduce political violence simply by committing resources. The unfortunate truth is sometimes, even if we have the best of intentions, it's not always easy to get from point A to point B. The good intentions are not necessarily enough. So, the speakers across the semester are going to ask a variety of questions related to this theme. Things like, can development efforts reduce violence? Under what conditions might development efforts actually increase violence? What kinds of conditions might development efforts be more or less likely to succeed? And then kind of turning things around, when might violence actually undermine development efforts? Okay, so the speakers are going to present their cutting-edge research, but the talks are aimed at a general audience, including undergraduate students. We hope to engage everybody in the room. If you have a cell phone, please just do me a favor and make sure it's turned to silent. I'll note that we are video recording the presentation, and the video recordings will be posted on a YouTube channel for the speaker series. Okay, so today we're absolutely thrilled to have with us Dr. Renard Sexton of the Emory Political Science Department. Dr. Sexton is new to the Emory community. This is his first year on campus, but he's already establishing himself as a leader in the discipline on the related topics of development and political violence. He's done research on the relationship between those two concepts, applying them to a variety of regions around the world. Today he's going to present his research in a talk entitled, Can Peace Be Built? Infrastructure and Violence in Afghanistan, the Philippines, and Beyond. He'll talk for about 30 minutes or so, no more than 30 minutes, and then we look forward to opening it up for discussion and question and answer. So, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Renard.
Thank you, Tommy. Appreciate it. It's a lot to live up to. Thanks a lot for coming. So today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some research that I've done, but also more generally how people have been thinking about this question of infrastructure, development, and peace in areas of conflict. We're going to be talking a bit about Afghanistan, a bit about the Philippines. The and beyond part is more thinking about like how do these things apply to other places. We're really going to focus on these two case studies for the bulk of the talk today. So the sort of motivating question of the research in the presentation today is how can you build peace? And there's a bit of a play on words here. You know, we often think about peace building in a generic sense as a concept where lots of different things could be deployed during and after conflict. But today we're going to be focusing specifically on building peace with built things, like construction. And I'll mention that we're going to be talking about two distinct time periods. One is during conflict, that is when violence is actually happening, and then also after conflict, which means after hostilities have ended. And what do I mean by conflict? So just to kind of give you a couple examples from our two case studies of the Philippines and Afghanistan. This is Marawi on the southern island of Mindanao in the Philippines. In late 2017, there was a major clash that took place. A group of militants from a subgroup called the Maute Brigade, or the Maute Brothers group, invaded a city called Marawi, which was the largest city in northern Mindanao. They took it over briefly. There was quite a bit of fighting. And then the Filipino military laid a siege to the city. And with support from very quiet support from the U.S. military and U.S. Special Forces, carried out a lot of raids, bombings, and eventually ejected the Maute Brothers group from the town. And as you can see from this image here, this was not a trivial battle. In fact, there was quite a bit of destruction, and we'll talk a little bit later about what the implications are. So this is, pretty serious conflict that we're talking about, not just a couple of people shooting at each other in the street. So the second case that we're going to talk about is Afghanistan, particularly Afghanistan during a period of time when there was a surge of American troops and personnel to the region. So this is Helmand Province in 2007. This is the period just before President Obama was elected and he began a surge in 2009. Helmand was the heart of a major U.S. offensive that was accompanied with a great deal of development aid that was intended to reduce violence. So in Helmand, this was the bloodiest fighting that the U.S. was involved in during the heart of their surge in Afghanistan. And so the implications of their decision-making at that time was really quite important. So kind of putting this in context of the whole world and kind of the post-World War II architecture that we see, if you look at this chart here, this is a nice depiction of the level of conflict going on in the world writ large. So 1946, the UN is inaugurated, or should I say the League of Nations is converted into the UN. The World War II is over. We very quickly see an increase in violence, in conflicts, particularly as decolonization takes place. The wars in the Korean Peninsula take place. Quite a number of interstate conflicts take place under the guise of the decolonization of the Cold War. But over time, particularly, if we look at the sort of longue durée view of this, over the 70 years, there are two big trends that have taken place. First is that we can see a dramatic reduction in the amount of conflict that is going on. So as we go from the end of World War II down to the present day, well, here the chart ends in 2016, we see a big reduction in conflict. The second thing is the composition of the types of different conflicts that are taking place, which are indicated here on the right-hand side, changes quite dramatically. And if you notice, there's quite a bit of blue here, and particularly in during the Cold War era, and those are conflicts that are taking place between countries. So one country's army is fighting with another country's army. Now, as we move farther to the right, you'll notice quite a bit more red and quite a bit more yellow. And red are civil conflicts, those are conflicts within countries, where there's some external state involving as an intervener. The yellow ones are those conflicts where there's not an external intervener. So just kind of zooming in on the last 20 years or so, you can see that particularly in the latter half, or in the 21st century, we see almost entirely, basically only two kinds of conflict. Those that are civil conflicts with or without foreign intervention. And the two cases that I mentioned to you earlier, Afghanistan and the Philippines, are both those where external forces are involved. So those fall into these red categories here. To just give you a sense of kind of some of the other ones that are high on the agenda of the international community in this regard, we talked about Afghanistan and the Philippines here, but two others that are sort of raging at the moment are Syria, as you've seen a lot in the news, where you've got Russia, Turkey, Iran, and the US, and numerous other international powers involved militarily, and then also Mali, which is the location of a major French overseas intervention. So each of these places have conflicts that are ongoing that have multiple different drivers and characters, whether they be ethnic, religious, ideological, but the main sort of thread that goes through all of them is that they're civil conflicts, that is, conflicts that are happening within countries and where external forces are intervening and impacting them. So these kinds of conflicts are pretty different from those that we often study or when we think about when we look back at our history books or history classes. So in a literal sense, it's not like the wars that maybe your grandfather participated or your great-grandfather. So just going back to kind of what we think of as war, let's go back to just before that chart began, which is the end of World War II. So when we go back to what we often think of as war, here's a classic example of the D-Day invasions of Normandy by the Allied forces. So this map indicates where the various Allied forces landed on June 6th, 1944, where more than 300,000 Allied troops landed over the course of 6 days. And eventually, over 1 million soldiers landed in Normandy and faced off with more than 800,000 German soldiers, some German, some Eastern European conscripts. So this is close to 2 million troops representing countries faced off over land territory that they wanted to contest. And to give you a sense of the visuals, here we have massive ships that are moving troops, vehicles moving troops, lots of personnel going around, and people shooting at each other throughout using the most modern technology that they had at the time. So fast forward to today, going back to Helmand Province that I mentioned earlier, instead of the United States fighting, an army of 800,000 soldiers, instead, the most dangerous thing that US soldiers encounter in Afghanistan, even till today, are roadside bombs. This is an image of an IED planting that where literally an insurgent planted a large bomb they tunneled under the road, they dug, they put probably a mortar shell underneath the road, and then either using a cell phone or using a long wire, waited until a US military convoy came by, and then set it off. And it flipped this MRAP on its side. More than 60% of US casualties in Afghanistan, and more than 70% of Afghan army casualties come from these roadside bombs, IEDs as they're called, improvised explosive devices. And then secondarily, when we think about, on the other side, what happens when foreign forces or their allies engage in sort of kinetic activities going forward, instead of shooting at big regiments of the opposition, instead it's going door to door in these local raids. So in this image you can see 3 Afghan army soldiers here going through the door, and a US Army advisor sitting on the roof, interfacing with helicopters above that are surveilling the situation and making recommendations to these soldiers. So these house-to-house raids are like the most common way that they're interacting with the enemy. And so in the words of a general at the time who was briefly very famous and then eventually fired by Obama for saying some choice words in a Rolling Stone interview, Stanley McChrystal sort of made clear what the US had learned over this period of time, which is that conventional war is not what they're experiencing at this time. And therefore, using all of your military technology to win is not necessarily going to be the case. So instead, they have a different problem. Not so much that you would be defeated by the army on the ground, but instead that you would lose the support of the population, who then are pivotal to the way you think about it. So instead, McChrystal, among many other military thinkers at the time, suggested kind of a 3-step process. And this is something that has been tried not only in Afghanistan, but many other places. First, provide the population with public goods. Second, in a very obvious sense, build some infrastructure such that their lives are improved, and also limit civilian casualties. And this is something that the US and British and French and others, during various sort of colonial-style interventions, attempted in different places. So the US in Vietnam attempted something called the Strategic Hamlet Initiative. The British in Malaya moved large populations away from their original areas and built new cities, essentially. And the French in Algeria tried some similar things. So when it comes to foreign forces trying to impose their will in these societies, the claim is basically that by not just shooting at people, instead improving infrastructure in particular, but among a basket of public goods, you can make better livelihoods for the local population and thereby reduce levels of violence. So for the rest of my talk today, what I'm going to be going over with you guys is 2 cases in which the US and its allies have attempted to do this kind of activity. So the first is Afghanistan, which we talked a little bit about earlier, and the second is the Philippines. So the sort of large research question that we're trying to get at here is to understand when it is that building this kind of infrastructure can help bring about peace, that is, reduce levels of violence. But more generally, it's useful to help us think about war and peace in general. So what does this teach us about the nature of insurgency, and what does this teach us about foreign occupying forces, foreign intervention in these places? And of course, when we think about it from a policy perspective, the line that we've been sort of given by those in favor of these kinds of activities is that these kind of investments help to stabilize countries and thus reduce the level of conflict. And one of the open questions is, well, is that actually the case? Do we have any business intervening in these places whatsoever? And even if we do, are these activities actually improving the scenarios, both for the local population and generally for international security? Okay, so to briefly characterize the conflict in the Philippines as it stands today, there are two major sort of insurgencies that are ongoing. And both have incredibly deep roots going back to the Spanish colonial period. So in orange here, you can see a depiction of where there have been conflict incidents over the last 2 years involving the Communist Party of the Philippines and their associated armed wing, the New People's Army. So since the 1960s, this largely rural guerrilla group have been sort of fighting against the central government and seeking to bring about sort of Marxist-Leninist style governance. In the south, particularly in Mindanao Island and in the Basilan, Sulu, and Tawi-Tawi Islands going down towards Borneo, there's the Moro Islamic insurgency. So this is a part of the Philippines that, at the same time that the Spanish were arriving in Luzon, were becoming increasingly Muslim during basically the 16th and 17th century. And to this day, there has been an ongoing battle for autonomy or independence in these regions among the Moro people. And they're called the Moros because the Spanish called them Moors, basically based on their interactions with North African Muslims. And to this day, they self-identify as Moros. So the areas here in blue are the primary zones where conflict has taken place over the last few years. Now, the Marawi case that I mentioned to you earlier is right here. Here's Marawi City in the north-central Mindanao Island. And this was by far the most intense clash that has taken place in recent years. And just to give you a sense of the scale, in Marawi City, which is not a big town by any means, certainly not a highly urbanized space, looking at kind of the core municipal area, there were more than 5,000 destroyed or damaged buildings. And most of this destruction was carried out by the Filipino military and its allies, including U.S. Assets, rather than the insurgents themselves, in their effort to sort of find, destroy, capture these people, these mounted people that had taken over the town. In terms of the human cost, the estimate is that around 900 militants were killed. A substantial number of these were actually teenagers that had been recruited from neighboring villages by the mounted group. They paid sometimes as little as $200 to the families to forcibly recruit these militants. At the same time, 150 to 200 government soldiers were killed and 1,400 wounded. But by far the biggest human cost came from civilians. Over 100,000 civilians were displaced by the violence here. Okay, so that's kind of the context for the Philippines case, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Now to kind of just give you a little bit of overview of the background to the Afghanistan, the current instantiation of the Afghanistan conflict. The current conflict basically emerged after the 9/11 attacks in the US. As you might know, the Taliban were playing host to Osama bin Laden, who was one of the architects of the 9/11 attacks. They refused to turn him over, and so the US decided to invade and remove him from power, under the auspices of the UN Security Council. So they came in literally on horseback, they knocked the Taliban out of power, and then began a long-standing security assistance force. So the international powers created a new government. They put their guy, Hamid Karzai, in charge, and then deployed a large number of troops and attempted to secure the country on behalf of this foreign-backed government. To give you a sense of kind of the trajectory of American involvement in Afghanistan, this is a chart that indicates from the initial invasion in 2002 to the present day, the level of troops that the U.S. committed to Afghanistan. So as you can see in the early days, it was actually a relatively modest investment of troops. Now, of course, during this early period is when the U.S. is busy invading Iraq, sending loads of troops there, having all kinds of problems. And so Afghanistan was very much on the back burner. Then, after President Obama took power, he decided to engage in what was called a surge, where the number of troops were essentially tripled. A massive amount of both civilian and military aid is sent. That lasts for a few years. at which point, in the middle of the second term, President Obama announces that the U.S. is going to essentially withdraw from Afghanistan by the end of 2014. Which doesn't actually happen, but you can see in 2014, by the end of 2014, the number of troops is radically reduced. And in President Trump's period, a similar pattern has gone. In fact, he has announced that he wants to completely withdraw from Afghanistan, but has not been able to come to a peace agreement yet with the Taliban. The U.S. aren't the only folks there, but by far, even today, with a very relatively small number of troops, they remain the biggest biggest troop contributor by far. And just kind of to illustrate who controls what, and this will be important for the analysis we do later, you can see that the Taliban have increasingly been able to control primarily more rural zones, but it's not constrained to just the south. It's really quite throughout the country. Quite a number of areas are contested, and relatively few zones remain strongly in government control. Okay, so with that background of these two cases, which are quite far from each other, the contexts are quite different, the backgrounds to why there's conflict there, the level of foreign engagement, these are all sort of distinct, but two very similar sets of programs were implemented in these two places. The one in the Philippines is known as PAMANA. The PAMANA program was started up in the previous government, so this is before now President Duterte under the Aquino administration. And essentially PAMANA was intended to target villages and municipalities that would receive a bunch of extra government funding in order to basically prepare the space for peace. So the idea was by injecting government resources into these barangays, you could basically win people over towards the side of peace rather than continued insurgency. And then on the Afghanistan side, we're going to talk about a program called SERP, the Commander's Emergency Response Program, which was a military administered program where local military commanders would do aid projects in the local areas. And the basic concept that was shared between these two initiatives was that by using small infrastructure projects, you could win the confidence in the local population. And by winning the confidence in the local population, you would help to encourage them to cooperate with military forces and presumably defeat the insurgents. So did it work? So now we're going to talk a little bit about some analysis that I've done to understand whether these achieved their goals. So the PAMANA program was launched in 2011. It initially went to just 600 villages in Mindanao. But in 2013, there was a major expansion. And it expanded to about 62% of the villages in Mindanao, or at least the ones where we have data. Over 2,300 barangays received PAMANA projects. And what we're going to do is compare those places that did to those that didn't, accounting for the ways in which they may differ from each other. So to give you a sense of where this actually took place, we're now going to look at the Bangsamoro area, which is the autonomous region in Mindanao. And just comparing 2011, which is when the program was piloted, you can see most of the zone, although with a few notable exceptions, had no PAMANA projects. By the time 2013 came along, there was a massive expansion. And in fact, most municipalities received at least one project. So in order to